You. Thanks, Vic. Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be helping host this event. And I have to thank Paul. He is the probably one of the very few people that gives up his time for free for our community. It's rare that we have somebody on the outside that is really with us and understands what we deal with. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Paul in case you don't know. He is an addiction psychotherapist, consultant and trainer with over 40 years of experience in the treatment of addictions. He is executive director of outcome consulting and clinical director of the outcome process. He has previously held the posts of head of treatment at Clouds House in the UK and clinical director at Crossroads Centre Antigua. He has consulted in the setup of treatment centres in Europe and America, is an expert in the treatment of process addictions, and has a special interest in developmental trauma. And Paul has some great videos, one particularly that really helped me on addiction and adoption, which was kind of life-changing for me. Finally, having somebody connect the two, it's just been so helpful for me. And we can put links at the end for people to find the videos. But for now, I'm going to introduce Paul.
Thanks, Zara. Thanks, Vic. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. And gosh, isn't actually it's a funny gig on a Sunday evening at 8 o'clock. And I'm actually in a hotel room. I'm away on business. And my first thought was I was going to blur the background, and then I thought, you know what, I'm so keen to talk about these disguised um, traumas that actually I just want to be fully present. So actually, you probably see my bed in the background here, so that's just how it is. And I've had a funny old day on a Sunday because I've been hanging out this afternoon with my soon-to-be 96-year-old mother. So anyway, here I am. I just want to sort of say that, and I share that just to sort of try and manage my autonomic nervous system and be present here. I mean, it really is a privilege. Normally, I give this talk to a bunch of clinicians who, in many ways, ought to know better. In fact, it's not really this talk because I think I'm just going to have a natter with you because I think you know an awful lot. But I'm quite passionate about talking about this stuff and trying to get some of my colleagues to get up to speed with what took me a long time to get up to speed, which is, these disguised traumas that have enormous impact on functioning and feeling, and relationship and so-called mental health. So normally I would talk to people who really ought to know better. And here I am talking to a bunch of people who haven't been allowed to know better. And I think I want to really acknowledge that it's a real privilege. Um, and I'm talking to people who've helped me and continue to help me co-create my understanding around all of this stuff. And my guess is that some of you have seen some of my talks before, and you'll know, I'm an addiction specialist. I became interested in this topic by accident. It started to really sort of show up in front of me, and I thought we can't ignore this. And when I trained in the 80s as an addictions counselor, we were very much just interested in drugs and alcohol. I mean, addiction was essentially drugs and alcohol. It was a long time, maybe towards the end of the 80s and the 90s, we realized that actually addiction is a disease that migrates, and many people uh, have addictions who aren't chemically dependent, and many people who have been chemically dependent, their addiction migrates to what we call process addictions. So basically, pretty much anything um, around human needs. So we're talking about relationships with food, with busyness, with relationship, with sex, with money. But we then started, and so we started to think about different stages of addiction. And the first stage of addiction is to do with, chemicals. It's pretty hard to help anybody actually who's addicted, who's still using mood altering chemicals, to really think about what's going on. The second stage of addiction is looking at process addictions. And this includes so-called codependency, which is a term you will all know. But by the way, it does not appear in any diagnostic manual. It is not a medical term, and yet it has so much meaning. And I want to talk a bit about that. because, codependency is a manifestation, I think, of complex PTSD. And I think any of you who identify, if I talk a bit about complex PTSD, will have what we're thinking about is codependency. And I want to try and give some definitions, I think, around all of that. And the third stage of addiction is trying to do something about our nervous systems, our autonomic nervous systems that hold traumatic stress. Because what we know for people who suffer from addiction, but actually pretty much anybody with a complex PTSD, at some point, and for you guys, this may never have happened, it's highly likely, but at some point you lost faith in human beings to regulate your mood. And you put your faith in something else. You may have had a fantasy of perfect care, a hunger for attachment, a hope that you could find somebody that could tell you what was going on. Meanwhile, you probably felt the only way forward is to be compulsively self-reliant and trying really hard. And if only I can get it right, then maybe I can be acceptable, safe, secure, lovable. But at some point, and I think because your wound is so early, it may well be. It's a bit like in psychology that sometimes people used to say things. We've stopped doing it now. Can think of a time that you felt really safe? And it's like you can't say that to some people with these early wounds. It probably never felt safe. But so I'm just going to have a bit of a natter. I made a few notes. I just thought, actually, if you've seen some of my other talks, you'll know quite a bit, about all of this. So, I really hope I don't say too many things that are just too obvious, and I hope I don't miss telling you about things that maybe you do want to know about. But I'm going to have a little go at talking about complex PTSD at the traumas of what I've called relinquishment, but I'm always prepared to change the name of that. I mean, I'm a clinician. I'm concerned with what happens clinically. What's been really interesting hanging around, I was going to say the adoption community, but I don't think it's fair to say that because there's so many individuals and so many different sort of ideas and stuff. But what I am aware of is how much, how political it is, and quite rightly so. And I was really, well, I suppose that wasn't my concern at first, and I've seen that, and it's sort of shocking, really. But I'm concerned with the clinical implications, what it feels like to have probably the biggest possible trauma, which is the separation from mother, whom you have got to know, whose voice you will have heard, who are set up, to hear again, to smell, to feel, what it means to be separated at the beginning of life. And I think it's harder to think of a bigger trauma. And Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, said actually the loss of mother was, we say the horrors of war pale into insignificance. That was her line about all of this. So, and complex PTSD is quite a new term. We've had PTSD I mean, it's been around for a long time. PTSD used to be called things like shell shock, didn't it, in World War One? But actually with the Vietnam veterans coming back from America, presenting all sorts of problems, both for America, but for themselves and their families, there was a real focus on post-traumatic stress disorder. And then in the 90s, there's a lady called Judith Herman, you may know. She wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery, and a brilliant. She was at Harvard Med School for a while. Certainly hung out with people like Bessel van der Kolk, whose name you'll know, and that lot. But she came up with complex PTSD as a term. But having done that, actually, I mean, it hasn't been taken on. The American Psychiatric Association do not recognize complex PTSD. ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Diseases, does recognize now complex PTSD. But the idea that complex PTSD is it is a trauma that happens over a period of time, very often is multiple traumas over a period of time, nearly always during childhood development. So the human brain that starts working before it's built is influenced by so many experiences. Um, and when I did my first talk that I think some of you have, posted and reposted back in, I don't even think when it was, 2010 or something, was the first time that they'd recorded it. Um, before a treatment centre then called LifeWorks, which was just starting to do some quite exciting things in this country. They were treating process addictions, and they wanted to do actually very expensive treatment centre, and they wanted to donate to the community some free talks. And I'd done a bit of a talk to one of their clinical team, and they said, "Would you do something that we could film and put on our website?" And I said, "Yeah, but I'm going to do this. I want to talk about this adoption thing because I think it's interesting." And an awful lot of people turned up there, far more than I imagined. Um, and so where am I? I tell you what, all traumas have two things in common: captivity and powerlessness. Whether you're in a natural disaster, whether you're being assaulted, if you're in a train crash, a road accident, traumas have these two things in common: captivity and powerlessness. And I think a complex PTSD has exactly the same. There is a sense, and certainly the idea of being given up at birth, soon after birth, in early, infanthood, is a sense of captivity and powerlessness. Interestingly, by the way, so is addiction, a captivity and powerlessness. And I'll talk a little bit about re-traumatization at some point. But complex PTSD is when the brain thinks that the traumas of the past are still happening. That is the truth. Past danger, threats to life feel present. The brain acts as if the trauma is either still happening or around the corner. And our autonomic nervous systems that are designed to protect us um, kick in. And you will have all heard of fight and flight and freeze, and the four F's actually, the fourth F being fawn that we talk about, which is actually codependency. Fawn is the, aligning oneself, subordinating one's needs, aligning oneself to the other in order to be safe, the looking after. But basically, the autonomic nervous system throws up these responses in order to protect us. Now, a lot of these things are really quite good. There are certainly, we could all agree there are times that, maybe we need to fight. It's probably a last resort. Certainly times we need to do a runner, do a flight. There might be times that we need to freeze, and there certainly might be times that we need to appease someone in some way and form. But the trouble is with complex PTSD is these F types, as we call them, get locked in the on position. So actually what happens from a very early age is that your nervous systems, so-called autonomic nervous systems, I think they should be called automatic actually, but nevertheless, we know it is an ANS, an autonomic nervous system. It throws up these fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses as an adaptive response to stress. But for people actually who've had the sort of wounds that you've had, that doesn't go away. It gets locked in the on position, and you become actually hyper vigilant about that stress. If there's been a catastrophe at the beginning of life, this is why we're top of the food chain. If it's happened once, it could happen again. So we get locked in this state of protection. And that hypervigilance around protection is mutually exclusive with connection and being present. You cannot be protected and connected at the same time. You cannot be hypervigilant and present, which is why actually, if you talk to I don't know, talk to people with CPTSD, if they've been to a party, they talk about things that most people might think were quite good fun as events that, well, I sort of got through it. Even all my friends were there, it should have been great. If I look back, it had all the ingredients, but somehow I just got through it. We're talking about enduring rather than enjoying. We're talking about surviving rather than thriving. We're talking about nervous systems that have been really, really impacted by all this stuff. And so, addiction is in a way, addiction is a sensible adaptive response. If you lose faith in human beings, then put your faith into something else. It of course becomes maladaptive, and I think we'd all agree that it's not a good long-term strategy, but it makes a sense at a time. But the trouble is, once you're locked in, you're locked in. But it's not just addiction. You guys, if some of you do identify, I really don't want to say that everybody who has been given up for adoption and been relinquished actually will have complex PTSD, because I just don't, I don't know. But I haven't met anyone who I think hasn't, I have to say. But but bear in mind, I see pathology in a clinic. Um, or people who contact me write to me. So you need to be careful about these things. So let's just talk, because here I lose all track of time too, and I want to just whiz through this. But those of you that have heard me said, look, I think this is a really complicated wound. Being and relinquished is the term I want to use. That's the experience for the child. Of course, it's clear to me that people are sold, trafficked, all sorts of appalling things happen politically. But the experience for the child that is internalized, so that experience becomes the architect of the brain, is I have been given up. And with that experience comes a whole lot of what we call negative cognitions. Negative cognitions are, we also call them unthought knowns, things that we know, but we don't think about knowing. And they might be things like, well, I'm not welcome anywhere, or what's the point of me, or someone or something else will be preferred over and above me, or chosen over me, or I will be left. So we're talking about people who, from the beginning of life, are biologically motivated to attach, but actually at the same time have a complete fear of attachment, which is one of the reasons that so many of you will show up with codependencies and/or what is colloquially called sort of love addiction. Also doesn't exist in any diagnostic manual, but somehow we know what it means. That hunger for attachment that has people putting themselves in harm's way and re-traumatizing themselves, in many ways. So, some very powerful negative cognitions that mean that very often with people with complex PTSD can neither be in a relationship nor not be in a relationship. And in fact, very often the best place is the place where the relationship could happen and there's a hope. We call it hopium, but isn't actually happening, because as soon as it happens, it could end. This is very, very difficult. There's an enormous conflicts between sort of biology and emotion and rational brain. But you'll know that I've talked about, look, an enormous trauma happens. It can't be recalled, but it is remembered. The issues are in your tissues. It's remembered. It finds expression. Certainly, these psychological issues find expression physiologically. Gastrointestinal issues, very, very common. People with early wounds. The baby's world is all about poo and wind and vomit. It's about the only place you can express anything. But gastrointestinal, dermatological, pains, and heart rate variability. And actually, for some people, some really awkward things happen physiologically, where you can have a really racy heart and a frozen stomach. It's like having a foot on the accelerator and a foot on the brake at the same time. Some really difficult stuff. So it can't be recalled, but this stuff is remembered. Okay. I've also talked about no pre-trauma personalities. This happens so early in life that you can't remember a time that you were okay. And often in my talk, I talk about having a road accident at some point where you might think, gosh, I don't want to get in the car again, don't want to go near that place. But at some point you knew you could drive a car and go near that place. You guys have not had that experience from the beginning. There is no pre-trauma personality. So you are vulnerable to thinking that actually perhaps, and I hear a lot of people say, I just don't have the resilience, but it's not them that don't have the resilience. This is a consequence of what happened. You were preparing to meet somebody who wasn't there, and it was experienced as life-threatening. The human infant knows without care they will die. It is life-threatening. It is traumatic. I used to say that were three things. So you've had a trauma, it can't be recalled, and there's no pre-trauma personality. But of course, there's a whole other trauma on top of this, which is it's actually disguised, sometimes dismissed. And as you know, yours is one of the few traumas that you're supposed to be grateful for. How confusing is that? How confusing is that? And which is why I think we get so many sort of somatic illnesses. Where does that, where does the energy go? That is like living with a confusion and not understood. And when we think about attachment theory, we think about there are four S's. You probably know this about of attachment theory. That every child needs these four things. One is to be seen for who they are. If you're seen, you can feel soothed. That's a second S. If you're soothed, you can feel safe, which is a state. And if you can feel safe, you can feel secure, ultimately, which is a trait. With these disguised traumas, people aren't seen. So you don't actually get past first base. And you're not only not seen, but you're told, but your reality is questioned. This is very confusing. So instead of feeling soothed by being seen, the only hope is self-soothing, which is why I think, and so actually, I think this is why there's such a high incidence of suicide amongst your population. And it nearly always gets triggered relationally at the end of a relationship because it's a flashback in ways. I'm keeping an eye on the time and just go so quickly. So I'm going to talk about some symptoms of complex PTSD, the sort of things that we're looking for now in people, in no particular order. But if you've had these wounds, if you live in if you're functioning, if your autonomic nervous system is in protect rather than connect, it is likely that most of the time you're in a state of hypervigilance. So that's the first symptom we're looking for. Some people all the time, but not always. But there's to a great extent hypervigilance, which means I cannot be present. I cannot be myself in relationship. I need to just keep an eye on how are you supposed to be around here. We see, so hypervigilance, we also see catastrophic thinking. No surprise, there's been a catastrophe, there'll be another one. So pretty much there's almost an expectation of something is going to go dangerously wrong. So whatever you're doing, you are considering the possibility of something going wrong. So a lot of paranoia, certainly no pronoia. Pronoia is when you think everyone's out to help you. That doesn't happen in CPTSD. We also get binary thinking, black and white thinking. And that's, of course, you do with trauma. Trauma is about life and death. So it's very much, if somebody comes at you with a knife, you don't think about, maybe I'll just get a few cuts. It's like you live or you die. So we get a lot of binary thinking. It happens a lot around relationships, actually. That whole idea, there's only one fish in the sea. I've got to have him or her. Otherwise, somehow, like there wouldn't be there'll be no one else. But of course, that's a direct nod to there's only one mother that becomes there's only one mother. But a lot of binary thinking, either get it right or I've got it completely wrong. We also get, and this is very confusing, what we call the unreliable witness. So actually, we get people believing that what they see is actually what's happening. But if you're coming at something with hypervigilance, you're going to err on the side of caution. So I often talk to people for whom, unless the other person is sort of smiling and nodding massively at them, they are hated. There's nothing in between, and seeing it and often seeing people's actions having negative intentions. So again, in relationship, you'll see people sort of thinking, well, I'm just second best, aren't I? I'm second best to the person you went out with before. Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because actually, if you're given up at the beginning of life, there is a sense that the sense is that the mother had something better to do that they preferred. We know that this is rubbish. This is about patriarchal society. We know there are so many reasons. We know people get sold, there's money, there's religion, but the experience for the child is I will be second best. So the unreliable witness, sort of expecting somehow there won't be space for me, unless I get my way, then the other will get their way completely. The idea, the opposite of codependence is co-creation. The idea that we could co-create something safely and that I could have a bit and you could have a bit is very, very difficult. We obviously get impaired self-care. There's some areas of self-care that people are very good at. It tends to nearly always be about presentation, if they are, how they look, because it's all about surviving and trying to fit in. But in general, self-care is really impaired with people with complex PTSD because it's about survival. Ultimately, it's about now, surviving now. Obviously, interpersonal problems in relationships. And then a symptom, which I think is fascinating, which is called re-traumatization, the ability for damaged people to put themselves in harm's way. The idea that, which is why people say, gosh, I found myself with going out with another alcoholic or another unavailable person. And at some point you have to have a word and say, well, actually, it might be a way that you're managing your unavailability. Maybe it's safe, but there's something about re-traumatization that people have. And addiction, of course, is a re-traumatization for people. They come out of one captivity and into another. There's an awful lot of hope here that it won't be like that, but that's what happens. We don't know why people re-traumatize. There's all sorts of theories. Sometimes people think, well, maybe it's about, I'm going to play the game again, and this time, maybe I'll win. This time I'll resolve this in some way. I'll tame the unavailable partner. But we do know that it happens. Um, we also, and the next three symptoms are symptoms of so many mental health diagnoses. And by the way, a mental health diagnosis, unlike a physiological one, there are no blood tests, pretty much everything, the stuff that's trending at the moment, ADD, ADHD, big trending thing, these are just, basically they're clusters of symptoms, and there's massive overlap. There's big overlap, by the way, with CPTSD and ADD, because if you're hypervigilant, you have problems with focus and concentration. Big overlap there. But so we're always going to get anxiety, a sense the world isn't a safe place. It's very common in mental health issues, and a sense of depression. And depression is an equation. It's a bit of maths. It's sort of low mood plus hopelessness equals depression, is what tends to happen. And that's, of course, how could you not? This is, for you guys, my guess is the feeling that you've predominantly had is of just being exhausted. Your nervous systems are exhausted, and at different times has enormous impact on your autoimmune systems. You'll have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, MEs, all these things, which are massive overlaps, I think, personally, with complex PTSD. But it's personal saying that. And shame, and everybody knows about shame now. And shame is an interesting thing, the feeling that, there's something wrong with me. Basically, I'm not right. I didn't get I didn't get the instruction manual. There were a few chapters missing. But actually, the thing about shame, I want you to know, is a defense. There's something wrong with me is a defense for the child against there's something wrong with them. Because if the infant feels there's something wrong with them, then it's a bit like, God bloody hell, how am I going to survive? Who's going to look after me? It also, the idea of there's something wrong with me, keeps the hope alive that if only I can just get it right, then everything will be okay.
Paul, you have 10 minutes. There's
thanks,
10 minutes.
thanks, Sarah. One more thing, I think flashbacks is worth mentioning. Now, if you have PTSD, you'll know, war veterans have flashbacks. They tend to they wake up, they think they're there, something's happening. Flashbacks for CPTSD are essentially what we call triggers. They're intense emotional and physical reactions. Again, triggers becoming quite a word, isn't it, in the vocabulary? Everyone said, you've triggered me, I've been triggered. But it does have meaning. I hope it doesn't get lost, but it does have meaning. A flashback is a trigger. There's something, people, places, very often smells, sounds, tastes, suddenly we used to call it perception. It's actually a neuroception. It's below perception. Our autonomic nervous systems pick stuff up before we even realize it, throw us into protect, and we are so-called triggered, as if the trauma is still happening. And it's a hijack. It's an amygdala hijack of the emotional brain. It's very powerful, these emotional flashbacks. I'll try in a moment just say a little bit about what on earth, can be done about all of this. Because actually, I'm not somebody who believes that, somehow you've got to get therapy or something, or with me or whatever to get better. I think there are so many things, so many other things that can be done. And I'm not touting, I'm not getting paid, I'm not touting for business, have a full clinic. I just believe in I guess, well, I want to thank you guys here, certainly for, helping me co-create what I know, but also believe in just in some sort of service. We keep what we have, don't we, by giving it away. Um, so what shall I tell you, talk to you about? I think maybe a little bit about maybe what we can do. Um, in I think one of the most important things, it's so de-shaming and we need to do, and so hasn't been done in therapy. I mean, I talk to people who've been adopted, who've had analytic therapies where they sit with somebody who maybe doesn't say anything to them or relate to them. And, that is really traumatizing. Talk about, increasing anxiety. Now, I don't think Freud was all wrong. Those of you who are therapists, I think there's massive contributions about conscious transference, countertransference, projection, all of that. But actually, you know, people get ill in relationships, don't they? And they need to get well in relationships. Alice Miller talked about an enlightened witness. I think the most important thing for people recovering from CPTSD is that they have that there is a relationship. But that is so much. It's easier to say, isn't it? Because actually, if you've lost faith in human beings, you're being asked to do something it's never felt safe to do. But co-regulation in relationship is the only way forward, risking something. And that is a big thing. I'm always think about, if you look on, you go onto Instagram and it's full of people telling you, how much sleep you should have, how much water you should have, what you should eat, when you should meditate. Maybe you should listen to your podcast at double speed, all this rather orthorexic, flight stuff. If only I can get it right, and it's quite addictive, isn't it? But actually, that's self-regulation. And if you have self-regulation without co-regulation, you're going to have an addiction because mental health is a relational health. Mental health is relational health. It's not about co-regulation. So I'm not knocking, ice baths, drinking water, meditation, any of it. I mean, this stuff is all really sort of important, and there's no one way or one thing to do, and beware of anybody who says there is. But unless you can risk doing what it never felt safe to do, which is to be able to say, finding, and this is hard, but this is where your communities come in, people who get you, places where you can get the psychoeducation. Somebody can say, look, this is a thing. This is a thing, because otherwise you have the shame, and I think we've all got a responsibility to try and pass this on now. I'm just really sorry that this information has been kept from you in the interests of adults meeting their needs over and above the needs of a child, which I think is what's happened, which, by the way, is Alice Miller's definition of child abuse. The adult's needs are put over above the needs of the child. Psychoeducation, really important, an enlightened witness, group work, co-regulation. If trauma is about captivity and powerlessness, we talk a lot to our patients about having a choice and a voice. It's pushing to say, actually, this is how I feel. This is what I want. And being really wary of those times. I talk to people who feel like, well, there's no point in saying this or that because it won't make any difference. He or she won't change. But actually, we speak our truth as long as no one's going to actually physically assault us. We speak our truth in order to treat ourselves as valuable. And that's when things change. Let's talk quickly about codependency, because I don't think you can have CPTSD without being codependent. Codependency is, and of course, the clue is it is an addiction. The clue's in the word dependency, guys. Codependency is when functioning becomes dependent on the real, perceived, or anticipated reactions of the other. They're feeling like, oh, I can't say this or do that or state my wants and needs because the other will do this or the other is doing this, or, I say, or I anticipate they'll do it, or perceived because of the unreliable witness, they just hate it if I do this or that. And codependence form it comes from two parts of the autonomic nervous system. It very obviously comes from the fawn response, which is, I safety comes from me putting the other at ease. I manage my anxiety by putting you at ease. So, whatever you want, however I need to be around you to have you at ease, I will do. It's that survival. But there's also a codependency that none of us want to own. And we all have these F types, by the way, in different ways. But for you guys, they're locked in the on position, or have been anyway. Um, the other one is the fight response codependency, which is managing anxiety by putting the other at dis-ease, a feeling of sort of power and control. Now, the bad news is relationally, fawn types tend to end up with fight types. So you get in relationship, one party, saying, I just can't get it right. And the other party pretty much behaving as if you're never going to get it right because I manage my anxiety by making you wrong. And it drives people crazy. The fight type as its extreme is a coercive controller or a narcissist. But actually, there's all sorts of other little bits, just putting the other at dis-ease. And the fawn type, this idea that safety comes from alignment. Quickly say something about freeze and flight. Addictions tend to be about freeze and flight. Alcoholism, benzodiazepine addiction, heroin addiction tend to be freeze things. The idea of freeze, people, the thinking behind freeze is that people in danger are synonymous. I just need to shut down, and I'll take drugs that will shut me down. Now, actually, you don't have to be an addict to go into freeze. Dissociation. I talk to adoptees particularly ones who've had, and because of course there are multiple relinquishments for many of you, as well as all sorts of crazy sort of transcultural, transracial adoptions that act as if life began with the adoption certificate. I mean, I'm staggered that, you can be adopted from one country and not have a right to have a passport in the country you're born. Do you know, Boris Johnson was born in New York. He's got a right to an American passport. You can decide whether you want to send him there or keep him here. But the point is, he has. There's like it's crazy, isn't it? It's crazy that you don't belong anywhere with all of this. But the freeze type, the flight type shows up in addiction. Anorexia is, well, actually, compulsive overeating is a freeze. I'm going to make myself, comfortable through the freezing. Anorexia is a flight. If only I can get my body right, everything will be okay. Orthorexia is, if only I can eat the right foods in the right way. The unhealthy obsession with, healthy living, which is orthorexia. Cocaine addiction, stimulant addiction, all about sort of flight. So I think we can see so many behaviors, not just addictions, as F-type responses from the autonomic nervous system that were adaptive but became maladaptive because they get locked in the on position. Very quickly, because I know I need to stop. I think, and of course, there's all sorts of thoughts about people want therapy and what can they do? We talk about EMDR. Some people think, if you know what EMDR is, that a lot of people say we can't do it on pre-verbal wounds, but actually, yes, you can, because you do it on the cognitions, like the things like I won't be welcome or I'm second best. We do a lot of equine assisted psychotherapy, very much helps people be present. If you're in a room with a half-a-ton animal, or not in a room, in a field with a half-a-ton animal, you're going to be present, and if you can regulate, horses have survived for 10,000 years. They're very, very tuned into heartbeat, respiration, body language. So it really helps people to just learn regulation. You regulate yourself. You can, I've got lovely pictures of people lying down with horses or with horses' heads in their laps because actually they found that they can regulate. There's a big interest in psychedelics. Don't want to say too much about it, but I think there's a fancy of perfect care. There's some help. It's a bit like dream analysis. I don't want to get sort of too into it, but it is not the solution. Might be helpful, as sort of stuff, and it'd be silly not to mention it because there's plenty of people who are trying to sell it and they're trying to get it licensed, by the way, so that there'll be clinics doing it on the high street and stuff. So be a bit suspicious of there's a business around both traumatizing and trying to treat trauma. Um, I mean, gosh, I've talked for 40 minutes. I hope I haven't talked too fast. I get quite excited actually, because I think, and I've been told off for doing that. And I'm sorry. Somebody said, "Well, how you shouldn't be so excited. This is such an awful thing for us," and I know it is. But what excites me is I really love the idea of calling something by its proper name. We can only change what we acknowledge, and all recoveries begin in terms of mental health by saying, actually, this is what's going on. And I might not be responsible for where it came from, but I do need to take a responsibility for, what happens next and how I recover. And I am going to have to do what has never felt safe. In fact, I'm going to have to do the thing that first damaged me, which is I'm going to have to put some trust in some others. And I'm going to have to educate myself about this. I hope I've made sense. Anyway, thank you so much. And again, I want to thank you because I've co-created my understanding really about all of this. Thanks to those of you who've been so generous with your information and trusted me. And I know some of you here. And thank you very much indeed. I hope it's made sense.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. I know that I can, watching everybody's faces, everybody's clapping in the chat, that I can speak for our community to say we so appreciate you. To have somebody that says it how it is, because for us, what's always so challenging is, well, I know an adoptee that doesn't feel like that. We get that so much. So to have somebody else outside of our community that doesn't sugarcoat it. This is how bad it is. But there is hope with the information that you give us that we can understand. And we don't have that much time, so I'm going to go through the questions, some of which you have answered in your talk. But the first question was, what is your view about current mental health provision for adoptees, and how do you think it can be improved?
I'm tempted to say there isn't any.
I know.
I think that's what I'm tempted to say. That just, it's been very difficult. I mean, actually, psychotherapists, technically, legally in the UK, aren't allowed to talk about just adoption as a wound. You need to be registered as an adoption agency. I think we get around it because we're addiction specialists, and you can't not talk. Can't talk about some things and not talk about others. Um, so I think the mental health field has got a bit of catching up to do. Some of you may have tried to get diagnosis for CPTSD. Actually, a lot of the people who are diagnosing probably trained when that wasn't really around for them. So I think I think we've got work to do, guys, haven't we? We've got work to do.
We do. And the second question was, if we have a diagnosis or symptoms of CPTSD, but are not in active addiction and don't have access to expensive therapies or are on a waiting list for help, are there things we can do to improve our lives and manage our symptoms? You mentioned some of them, some of the therapies, but is there anything else you want to add?
I think the biggest thing that you can do to manage, so what you really need to understand that in a sense, mental health is actually it's sort of nervous system help. It's also health. Um, in order to take yourself out of hypervigilance and into being present, the most effective thing you can do is the out breath. I'm sure you know this, but your lungs are the only organ that you've got control over. People with CPTSD, anxious, people with anxiety are shallow breathers. That's part of hypervigilance. It's why actually anxious people smoke, because it's one of the few times that you do a long out breath. You can take your nervous system out of what's erroneously called the sympathetic state, which is fight and flight and hypervigilance, into what's called parasympathetic, which is a sort of actually the creative present place where ideas can come to you and you can chill, you know. but the out breath, it's why chanting hymns, the hymns that are favored most have got the longest notes. The out breath is a really important thing. And guys, that's free. But actually, you're going to have to train yourselves. A bit like if you're going to run a marathon. If you're going to run a 10K, my guess is that most of you, I don't know, certainly I would, we'd have to do a bit of training. We wouldn't just do it straight away. It's exactly the same. You have to train your nervous systems into being in a parasympathetic state. The long out breath. Set your timers for 2 minutes. Sit there. Put your feet on the ground. The sigh of relief. That's the thing. Antidepressants, by the way, been a massive placebo with that. We think now the meta-analysis is about 70% of the effectiveness of antidepressants is placebo, which is why the psychedelic community who are saying that actually psychedelics are as effective as SSRIs at 6 months is not really such a great claim because of the placebo thing. I don't know, I've probably gone way off somewhere, but there you go. Breathe.
The breathing, I struggle my whole life with the shallow breathing. Singing helps,
Of course, and that's why you do it, Zara, probably.
and I smoked like crazy, but now I don't. Okay, so the next question is, what's your theory about why adoption increases the risk of suicidality?
I like this question because, of course, it's a theory and who knows. But my theory, I mean, firstly, that is the case. Adoptees are overrepresented in, mental health, addiction, prisons, suicide rates. I think it's something to do with a flashback. The people that I talk to who feel suicidal, it nearly always happens at some point in relationship, at some rupture in relationship. And I think there's a flashback. So, mother becomes the other. The relationship breakdown feels life-threatening. There's a model, there's a map of it being life-threatening. And if you think about the human infant, without care, I will die. It is a life-threatening thing to be given up by mother. It just is, you know. And it's bloody confusing when you've got somebody else who smells different and sounds different and has actually probably got their own stuff going on, who's adopting, may have their own grief. And what isn't acknowledged is felt. This is the problem. It's the same with transgenerational trauma. If we don't talk about stuff, it is felt, and you guys will feel, this stuff. But I think that suicidality is a flashback. There's a reminder in the end, in a relationship rupture of the first rupture, the life-threatening one at the beginning of life. That's my pet theory.
And I think that would also include death. Loss of adopted parents for us too can really bring that back up again.
Yeah, no, good point, actually. I mean, that is a major rupture, of course. End of, yeah.
Another question, you've talked about the need to feel seen. Do you think that lack of knowledge about ourselves and the lack of acknowledgement of our true selves by society make it even harder for adoptees to feel seen?
Yeah, it is so perplexing, isn't it? To have a feeling that is contrary to, or be told something else is going on, is contrary to how you feel. Being seen is so important as human beings. We exist in groups. In order to be in the group, we need to feel accepted. We need to be seen, for who we are to manage our nervous system. So I think not being seen, I think it's awful that there's been such a cover up. And I think I said that. I think that was my problem with the word adoption, it acts as if life began with the signing of a certificate. Do you know?
And I think what's helpful for anyone out there that does speak or is beginning to write about their experience is that we do things together.
Mm,
Because my experience has been when I've been on my own, oh, you're just an adoptee that feels that way. It was because of your adopted family.
mm,
Um, so I think it's really great when we do things together. I feel that we're more seen and heard.
mm,
We're up against other people that can write books about adoptees, and they get listened to more that are not adopted than us that do this work. So that's why I think there is a power in the group.
mm.
Other question is, what in your view are the psychological impacts of being a late discovery adoptee?
other than having the rug pulled from under your feet, having realized how betrayed you've been, having to reassess absolutely everything, I think it's an enormous psychic wound. You don't come across it that much now, but I really have. I've come across a couple of people that didn't find out they were adopted until they needed their birth certificate, when they're getting married. I don't know. Can I say it? What the fuck? No,
Like serious.
you know. So yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, it's an all, but the point in which you're given up or adopted, and we really got to understand that there are lots of relinquishments, care homes, foster homes, many people adopted, given back, it's a bit like being a pet or something. Do you know? It's really, there's often there's not it's not just one incident of a relinquishment. It's suddenly like, okay, maybe I'm safe here. I know these smells. I heard this sound yesterday. I seem to be alive, and then it changes again.
Yeah. Well, I have one more question and then we just have a few more minutes. It's 10 to. How can we increase the understanding of the problems faced by adoptees amongst psychotherapists and other professionals?
And I think we need to organize events. I'm going to keep talking about it. There are other people, there's a lot of you that are doing training in psychotherapy and counseling, and we need to just not miss the opportunity to talk about it. My sector is quite small, in terms of addiction, and this is a really small part of what I do, but I really try not to miss the opportunity to talk about this. I'm also quite keen to talk about the other disguised trauma, which is boarding school syndrome, the very peculiar British habit of sending, historically young boys and girls, but primarily boys, aged sort of 7 away from home and placing them in captivity, powerless and often open to abuse, and then letting them run our country.
Yeah.
But that's disguised. Best years of your life. It'll be the making of you. And actually, talk to adoptees who are often in the UK adopted into middle class families and go off. Here's some terrible stories. I mean, what a re-traumatization that is. Do you know? Because basically, there we go from one captivity and powerlessness off to another. Nobody's seeing it. Again, all of that being denied and disguised and dismissed.
Yeah. So,
But we need to do it. And answer, maybe I didn't answer the question, but we need to do this stuff. And there are people coming along and you guys and talking about it. It's an awful thing, isn't it? That in some ways, I'm probably taken more seriously than you.
yes,
And I'm really sorry that that's the case. Because, which is just mad. And just because I'm coming at it as a clinician who's not invested in it. But, this stuff will change. Stuff will change.
I hope so.
But
Yeah,
we need to do it. We can't change what's happened. We have a responsibility now, I think.
yeah, yeah. So, we're coming up to sort of it's 8:53. Vic, were there any other questions?
We did have a last minute one that I spoke to Paul quickly about beforehand. Vanessa's got it. Yeah.
About a different kind of diagnosis, a different kind of trauma, and I've already forgotten what it was. There's somebody asking in the chat about if you've got anything to say about transracial adoption, and there's someone asking in the chat if you've got anything to say about
Developmental.
That's it. That's it.
I mean, I think the thing is that people started to realize that there was a whole post-traumatic stress disorder that didn't really fit with, accidents, assaults, natural disasters, war zones, imprisonment, and started to think about what should it be called. And the first, and people like Bessel van der Kolk, who you've heard about, there was a whole bunch at Harvard Med School, Judith Herman, were all pushing for the American Psychiatric Association to include in their manual, which is called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, in the 5th edition. They were pushing to have something that they wanted to be called developmental trauma disorder. When I did my talk in 2000 and whatever it was, 10 or something, the first one that some of you will have seen, I think I said the same thing. I think I probably said then, I think it should be called a developmental post-traumatic stress disorder. Anyway, that didn't happen. God knows why it didn't. There was I think there was a big battle between old school and new school traumatologists, basically. But the International Classification of Diseases picked it up and had CPTSD. And I think whilst it should be called developmental trauma disorder, we know what that is all about. It isn't technically called that. But it's like words like codependency. These words, they have a lot of meaning to the people that suffer. And, I think, hey, I don't know. I don't know if that answers that question. What was
And
the
just
Sorry.
to wrap up, because I know you need to go as well. Somebody did ask about somatic. What do you think about somatic therapy? They said it was very helpful for them.
Yeah, absolutely. The issues are in the tissues. This is, this felt all over. And of course, there are lots of somatic manifestations of these psychological problems. So, there are different types of somatic therapies, cranial, right from craniosacral. I think some of that stuff is really useful. I basically that I would discourage anybody doing anything with anyone who didn't actually acknowledge that this is a thing, that actually being relinquished and adopted is a thing. Because if you don't, then whatever you feel, whatever healing you're trying to get, it's going to be really confused. But the phrase in the somatic community is the issues are in the tissues, and it's not just in the mind. It's the body that holds all of this stuff.
And there was one more. Sorry, Vanessa, am I jumping ahead? I literally have to go in 2 minutes. I'm so sorry because I'd love to stay and chat. But somebody just wanted to, if there was anything else you could say about being a transracial adoptee. I mean, there's so much. I feel like we need like a whole other session.
Well, Jenna, it's just it's so confusing. It's nearly in every incident. I think it's from black to white for starters. I think it's very confusing. I think it's appalling that you have no rights for the place in which you're born to be a citizen. I think it's really people end up feeling like, well, I don't belong in either camp. I think that certainly, there's certain countries for whom, a lot of money has changed hands for babies. I was hearing, actually, I heard last week about a case where somebody in southern India had a baby, couldn't pay the mother was unable to pay the hospital fees, and the child was sold to adoption in Germany. This is sometimes this is not a current thing. So some of these things are just sort of shocking. I think you're just really left feeling confused, wondering where you belong. But all adoption is a displacement, but maybe some a lot more than others.
And I think because I do have to go, but I'm just so happy to see everybody. And I think more of these events are just so helpful for all of us, really. So thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to the adult adoptee movement. And we still have work to do. We still want our apology from the government. Somebody had asked what you think about that. So lots more to talk about, but I actually have to run, and I will say goodbye, and I'll see you again soon.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you guys to it, but thank you so much for listening. Really enjoyed it, and thanks again, really, for helping me co-create my developing understanding about this. And I pledge my support if that helps. I really do. So,
Well, a massive thank you from all of us for giving your time so generously and for sharing your thoughts so generously. A massive thank you from us.
Thanks, Vic. Goodbye, everybody. Best wishes.